Welcome to Agile Coach's Corner by AgileThought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to this episode of Agile Coach's Corner podcast. I want to thank you for listening to us today. Our goal here is to bring you Agile topics in an approachable way. And if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss or explore in a future episode, email it to us at podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it to us with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast. With me today is Adam Ulery, and we're going to be exploring some facilitation tips. Facilitation is a pretty important skill for a lot of different roles, and so we'll give you some basic tips as well as some pro tips. So thanks for joining today, Adam.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad to be here.
What type of roles do you see needing to have solid facilitation skills?
I think it's especially useful in a role like the Scrum Master and any type of coach, Agile coach, or otherwise. And really anyone who's going to be leading meetings or working sessions or workshops or even trainings. So anybody who would be in a role like that would benefit from having strong facilitation skills.
And what type of events do you kind of see those facilitation skills really being used for? You mentioned Scrum Master, so it brings to mind for me events like obviously the sprint planning, the daily Scrum, sprint reviews, retrospectives, the baked-in Scrum events. And where else do you see those skills coming in handy?
Yeah, certainly those events. And then workshops where you're trying to teach a concept to a group of people. I think they're really valuable there. Also, other events outside the Scrum events, say in a scaled environment, a release planning or quarterly planning type of event. They're really useful there. Maybe an event where you're doing some dependency mapping or story mapping. Any of those types of events where you've got a large number of people and you have a goal, you're after an outcome, and you want a large number of people who may or may not be on the same page about all of that together to be productive.
Yeah, definitely. It can really kind of go sideways if you get a lot of people together. If the goal's not clear once you've got them all, people are on different pages, either different pages about the goal or different pages about what the outcome of that meeting should be. So how do you help keep those sessions on track? What are some of the basics to good facilitation that you want to cover?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dan. I think most of these are pretty simple. And it's funny because as we talk about them, people might think, well, that seems obvious. But as obvious as it seems, they're foundational, super helpful, and not everyone does them. So things like preparing in advance, actually spend time in advance of the event and prepare. So understand what you need for the session to be successful in terms of supplies, room setup, having information radiators in the room and getting in there early to put those up, understanding what the goal of the session is, doing all of that in advance to prepare yourself as the facilitator makes a huge difference. And I mentioned a word in there, information radiators, that I'm assuming people know what that is, but maybe everyone doesn't. So I'm happy to talk about that because that specifically is a tool that I think every facilitator should have in their toolkit.
Yeah, so let's cover information radiators. And so for me, that brings to mind just what are the important pieces of data, of agenda, of topics being discussed, and how do you make them really obvious to people so that they don't have to go digging for them? They just they radiate off the wall. Is that in line with how you are thinking of that?
Yeah, information radiators they're literally what they sound like. It's a way to display information so that everyone can see it and they can get that information whenever they'd like. They don't have to ask for it. So an example of an information radiator is a big, one of those giant easel Post-it stickies that you could put on the wall, right? Or writing on a whiteboard with a dry erase marker, something like that everyone can see who's in the session. And things that are valuable to have up for everyone to see at any given time during your session are the agenda. People really like to know what they're going to talk about, or at least what's planned for them to step through. And it should be at a pretty high level. You don't want to put the details that could possibly change because it's okay for them to change in there. That might confuse people. At a higher level, though, what you intend to cover, it's nice for people to know what's coming. So that would be a nice thing to have on an information radiator in the room.
Definitely. And I think of the topic, like what is the topic that you're there to discuss? Because I think that'll help keep guardrails on the conversation. One of the things you'd mentioned is the parking lot. So having a parking lot for things. And so if you have the goal and you have a parking lot, then you can help let people know that they've been heard and help keep the conversation on track without them feeling ignored.
Yeah, and the parking lot is, I think, one of the most useful skills or tools, however you want to think of that. But also, I like having that on a big easel post-it on the wall or on a whiteboard somewhere, and it's a very useful way to keep things on track. We can talk more about it in a few minutes, maybe. But yeah, those are, I think, are the kind of a couple of big ones. And another one is a working agreement or a teaming agreement about the meeting. So it's nice to take just a couple minutes at the very beginning of the meeting and set some ground rules for the meeting and to write those up somewhere where we could refer to them during the meeting and sort of check ourselves and point to that. If we're having an issue, or if, it feels like we're going off track in some way, or we're deviating from what we agreed to, we have it there visible for everyone to see. And we can point back to that instead of pointing at someone. Our attention is directed to the rule we all agreed to rather than a person, which helps keep that environment safe and those creative ideas free flowing.
And you have the opportunity then to be proactive on those. So frequent things that I see disrupting meetings is people tuning out into their smartphones or into their emails. So you can have a conversation about what do we do about electronics, who's on call. Maybe somebody legitimately needs to be tuned out versus active disengagement where they're just moving on. And so, yeah, those things in working agreements. The other one that comes to mind is a lot of times there are interrupters, people who will interrupt other people's thoughts before they're done. And so how do you don't want to say, hey, so-and-so, stop it, like every time, but you can have the working agreement. And I think that's what you were referring to. Our agreement set out at the start is we let people finish. We don't interrupt. We hear them out, those types of things.
Right. I mean, it feels more comfortable, particularly for the person, but especially for the whole group, for a facilitator to be able to say when someone is interrupting. So what did we agree to about interrupting and how we would collaborate during the session versus, Dan, I've noticed that you're interrupting again.
Definitely.
Right?
That's a good one. Yeah. And especially there are some people speak with a cadence, and, you called on me, which is, you called me out. I feel bad. But some people take long gaps in the sentences. And I know at times I will hop in thinking they're done, not to cut them off, but just not realizing that they aren't done yet because of a slower cadence. And so for me, that's a conscious effort sometimes not to hop in with the next thought. And so having those types of working agreements is super valuable.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very useful tool.
You mentioned room setup almost in passing, and I wanted to just mention that or circle back to it because the physical setup of the room says a lot about what's expected to happen. If you have a room with a large kind of boardroom style table where there's a head and a the other end, or do you have whiteboards available? Is the furniture rearrangeable? Though that room setup can have a huge impact on the flow of the meeting and people's ability to participate.
Yeah, it really can. And if you're doing your prep work in advance, you'll be able to compensate for some situations that may not be ideal. versus walking in and realizing at that moment, oh no, this is not right at all. I need a lot of whiteboard space for this session and we've got none, right? But if you did some prep work, you could figure out some ways to make that happen, maybe bring in some rolling whiteboards or whatever.
The rolling whiteboards, yeah, you mentioned the Post-it big flip charts, and I don't mind saying Post-it brand because I've used off brands and the things don't stick. It's like, it sounds good, they're cheaper, but they don't stick. So love the Post-it, love the Post-it brand.
Yeah, I agree.
So you can compensate with the room setup. So if you've got the room set up, your agenda, a parking lot, you have the appropriate supplies, you've made sure that the whiteboard marker's actually right instead of, pulling up 3 of them and realizing they're all dry. What are some of the other common tools that you use?
Well, one is to clarify the roles in the meeting. I like to know who's there, what they plan to do for, what their role in the meeting will be, how they'll participate. And that's very helpful for everyone to understand so that we can kind of maintain balance in the meeting. And this is pretty closely related. I feel like it's pretty closely related to keeping the audience focused on their goal, which you mentioned earlier, having the goal of the meeting displayed on a radiator. I really love that. But knowing who the players are and what their goal is really helps you as a facilitator to help them achieve their goal, keep them moving, and understand who should be playing in what space, if you will.
In addition to knowing who's in what space, it also can help identify, is there a role missing? So if you are facilitating and trying to get to a conclusion, but you don't have the decider in the room, or if you risk being vetoed as soon as you walk out of the room, I see knowing that about the roles as being a huge advantage as well.
Yeah.
So identifying a missing role.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. And at least then the people present can decide what they want to do about that. About it. It's not something that sort of just happens to the group, which can detract from their productivity, right?
Absolutely. Do you continue knowing that there's a chance you get vetoed? Do you go get that person? Do you take them some options that they'll then get to choose from? Correct. Being really intentional about how to go about that missing role.
Right. Another thing we mentioned, Dan, a couple times that's worth diving into a little more is the parking lot. I think that is a super important tool for a facilitator. It's probably one of your biggest levers in a meeting to keep those people who would take you off track in check. It's a super useful way to table items without the risk of losing it. A lot of times people who won't let go of something and will take an entire meeting off track are afraid their idea won't be heard and it'll be lost. This gives them that reassurance because a parking lot is a place where you can put items that are out of scope for the current conversation, but you don't want to lose sight of. After the meeting, you can decide what you want to do with this list of items. So if that starts happening within the meeting and someone starts to take you off track, as a facilitator, you can make the call on how long you want to let that go. And when it feels like, okay, this is taking up too much time and it's starting to take us away from our goal for the meeting, you can politely interject and ask the group if this is something we'd like to put on the parking lot. I like to put it back on them and allow them to make the decision. Because if you allow the group that's there to accomplish something to make the decision and they own it, they're going to feel so much better about it. And they've had the option. And then at that point, if they do decide to continue to run with it, it's their choice. They've made the choice, and that's okay.
I've been in a session where it felt like somebody was taking us off track. And when taking it to the group, they were like, no, like the thing they're bringing up is the showstopper for the goal that we stated. And so as a facilitator, I wanted to stick with the goal that we had, but the group then correctly pointed out, no, this thing that's coming up is way more important or is a precondition to achieving that other goal. So it needs to be vetted now. It can't go on the parking lot. And so that becomes a very valuable digression into another topic. And so maintaining that flexibility as a facilitator is a big deal.
Yeah, it really is. And this golden tool, the parking lot, helps us with that so much. We can use it as a way to say, is this something we should put on the parking lot? And then they won't lose sight of it. They'll feel comfortable. We can move on. So many times I've had someone who really didn't want to let go of it agree effortlessly to put it on the parking lot as soon as they realized, oh, it's not going to get lost. And then we can move on.
I've been heard, and we'll come back to it if we have time, or maybe it's part of the scheduled agenda for later, or maybe that's a separate meeting afterwards. But either way, it's like, yep, you feel validated.
Right, exactly.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
So what are some deciding tactics? If we've got our goal and we're working through, there are different tests for agreement that can be used. And I know you had a few you wanted to touch on. So things like Roman voting come to mind for me. Do we continue on a topic, or do we, thumbs up, thumbs down?
Right. Yeah, there's a handful of those little, whatever you call them, facilitator tools, or decide, what you said there, Dan, that I really like. And that's a great one. There's one called a fist of five, which I think's a really nice way to get really quick consensus from a large group. And what you do is you hold up your hand as a fist and you have everyone vote on something. So, Dan, do we agree that this is a good idea and a direction we should move forward? If you hold up a 1, I know that you think it's an absolutely horrible idea. You're really opposed to it. If you hold up a 5, you are completely on board with it. And everything in the middle is some degree towards one or the other. 1, 2, 3, vote. Everyone holds up their number of fingers. And now we've got a really quick, clear picture of how the whole group thinks, and we can decide what to do with that. That's called fist of 5.
Definitely. And the ones, when we do a fist of 5, that I tend to pull on the most are the 1s and the 2s. Like, why it's okay not to support it, but what's the concern behind the lack of support? And is it something we can address? So those become really interesting data points.
Yeah, and powerful tools if you're trying to gain consensus. If that's one of the goals in your meeting, for example, maybe you're trying to set an OKR or a goal or something that the whole group really needs to get behind. It's a great way to get to that. You can decide where you are, and if you've got some 1s, you're not there yet. Helps you get there quickly because they can voice why they voted the 1, and now the group can collaborate and start to get closer to the 5.
You touched on something really interesting there, which is, are we trying to get to consensus? And something facilitators can really benefit from is clarifying how we decide before it's time to decide. So what I mean by that is, do we need a consensus? Is that what we're going for? Are we going for majority rule, where we don't need a consensus, but we're going to go with the majority? Are we advising somebody else outside and trying to put together those options? So clarifying how we're going to decide before we get to the point where you need to decide something is something I've seen be very valuable for facilitators.
It's great. And that could even be something that goes in the meeting agreement at the beginning.
Right. And some decisions will be, one way versus the other. Restroom breaks. Like, if you need one, take one. We don't need to have a consensus on whether, people are going to get up and go use the facilities. We don't all have to agree on what's going to be brought in for lunch. Maybe you have several different options.
Right. Another basic one, Dan, that I think I learned in kindergarten is the show of hands. It's simple, but it's a really good tool as a facilitator. If we just need a yes, no, kind of an understanding about what the group thinks, show of hands for who agrees with that, And I use this all the time for what you just mentioned, right? Show of hands, would we like to take a 5-minute bio break? And then if the majority of the hand, if several, enough hands go up, it's like, yeah, let's take one. These people need it.
Definitely. Definitely. When doing a workshop, a lot of times there's a breakout and it's loud and raucous, and I've seen facilitators try and kind of, hey, come back, and it's really awkward when you're trying to shout down a room of very active people.
Right.
And so there's a better way of doing that I think you could share with us.
Yeah, Dan, this is one of my favorites, actually. I think because I learned it in preschool, not kindergarten.
Your education was far more valuable than mine.
No, this is just an awesome tool because of its simplicity and its power. How well it works is amazing. I don't know what the official name of it is. I kind of call it the raise hand quiet. So what you do in that situation where you've got a large crowd that's very excited and noisy and talking is you raise your hand. I usually just stand tall in the middle of the room where the most people can see me and raise my right hand as high as I can. And you explain to everyone in the beginning how this works. So they know when you see someone standing there with their hand raised really high, not saying anything, mimic that. Stop what you're doing, stop talking, and raise your hand high. And it is amazing. I've had groups of almost 100 in a loud, really excited environment, and you can get them quiet in less than 10 seconds doing this.
It's amazing to see that work, and I think it's been done even at the big Agile conference, where the person doing kind of a keynote style address had a breakout, and you can watch the hush fall across 1,000 people almost instantly because it's such a familiar approach in a lot of circles. But it's always new to somebody, and so that's a very important tip to share.
Yeah, I think so, and it's cool to see. I love that one.
So when you've got a lot of different options identified, let's say we've brainstormed some things, we've got a bunch of sticky notes on the wall, and we need to select from a bunch of those.
Dan, dot voting is a really nice tool for this. So dot voting is where you give each person a certain number of votes, and they can use them any way they like. A pretty standard way to do it is to give each person 3 votes. That almost always works out really well for some reason. I'm not sure the math behind why 3 works so well, but I've just found it does. And each person can use them any way they like. So they could put all 3 on one of the items if they really, really want to see that one get voted up. They can split it across and put, 1 on each of 3 items, etc. So you can do this using little sticker dots, like stickies, or you can use markers like a Sharpie, or if you're doing it on a whiteboard, you could use a dry erase, some way to make a vote. And then you simply take the item with the most number of votes, and that's kind of the most desired item. And the one with the least number is the least. I used it this week, actually. I was with a large group for the Tampa Bay Scrum Masters Guild. Actually, we used it, and we had 13 topics. We wanted to distill down to 9. We dot voted, and we took the 9 topics with the most votes. It worked beautifully.
It's a nice way to feel like you don't have to go through the entire list. You've then taken the energy of the room, you've figured out generally where it lies, and you can address the majority of the interest without feeling like you need to talk about everything. It's great.
Yeah. I use this with my family. We dot vote on activities, vacations, things we'd like to do.
That's awesome. Yes, not just confined to the project team.
Right, exactly.
Fantastic. Oh, and we've mentioned a bunch of different tips, and so now's probably a good opportunity to mention that we will have show notes available. We'll link out to different resources, and folks can find that on agilethought.com/podcast. So we've talked about a bunch of kind of basic facilitation tips. Then we get into things that are maybe more nuanced or maybe more pro tips here. And so one of them is, letting the group make the decision. And I want you to go into that, because what I've seen kind of an anti-pattern is where the facilitator, and I use my little air quotes, facilitator, is really somebody just with an agenda, meaning they want something very specific to be the outcome of that meeting. And it can get, it feels really disingenuous when somebody's up there, quote, facilitating, but driving you to the conclusion they want. So how does it look to put the decision onto the people who are in the meeting?
It's really important for the facilitator to maintain neutrality, to not be the one making decisions in the meeting. And I like to understand the roles, as we said earlier. So I can always be ensuring that people own their roles. And they're, for example, let's say we have some discussion where a business owner needs to make a decision. If that person's in the room, I will work to make sure that they're doing that. Or maybe we need a more technical decision. If the architect's in the room, I will be working with them to make sure they're owning that. Always putting the decisions back on them, making sure that I'm not doing that. And it's really important to do this. And if you must wear two hats, let's say that you are facilitating the meeting, but you also have to participate. I recommend making it really clear when you're switching. I literally will say, I'm wearing two hats in this meeting. I'm facilitating, and that's my primary role. But I'm also the Agile coach. So if I need to talk Agile coach, I will physically make it look like I'm taking off a hat, and I will be saying, I'm taking off my facilitator hat right now and putting on my Agile coach hat. And then I'll say what I need to say. And then I'll say, okay, my Agile coach hat is coming off, my facilitator hat's back on. And it sounds kind of goofy, but it helps everyone understand exactly what role I'm playing. And I don't fall into the trap of stepping outside of my boundaries as the facilitator.
I had the opportunity to do a professional Scrum Foundations training with Eric Landis, who's our certified trainer. And we actually had a hat that we wore because we were supposed to play the role of customer at one point. And at times the customer's being difficult, but you don't want to, as the trainer or facilitator, be difficult or give bad information. So we actually had a baseball cap that when we were in the persona of product owner, would put on. It was a really nice addition to the mimicry of the movement, was to actually have a baseball hat. And because I'm follically challenged, I always have one with me to keep the sun off my head. And so it was really surprisingly powerful to have that physical cue that there's this role or that role. So, yeah, you could even find a physical cue to go with the mimicry or the pantomiming of the role.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that. And another thing that kind of ties in closely to this is controlling your own reactions. It's actually easier for you as a facilitator if you don't really understand the subject. Honestly, it may sound counterintuitive, but that helps you maintain that neutrality easier if you don't really understand it, because you can kind of use your ignorance as a to your advantage. But if you do, and you happen to be passionate about it, you may find yourself giving up how you feel, wincing, or your facial reaction in some way. And that can really influence an audience. And you don't want to do that. You want to maintain neutrality as much as possible to help the audience come up with their best outcomes possible. So it's important for really good facilitators to control the reactions.
I find that you don't necessarily know where something's going. You might hear something and you think, ooh, what a terrible idea. And then later realize that, oh, wait, I assumed because of whatever frame that they were going this place, and they're actually going somewhere else. And it turns out to be perhaps a different destination than it sounded like. And so you're right that maintaining neutrality in expression, as well as probably just as importantly in thought, try not to prejudge or think you know where somebody's going, and withhold that evaluation. And then go for it.
Yeah, I agree. Another pro tip is to actively listen and clarify. So I like to clarify things I hear, even if it may seem obvious, make it explicit. And that helps the team really think about where they're going and what they're discussing.
In addition to kind of listening and clarifying, taking an opportunity to write down the thing that you thought you've heard. If it's a proposed path forward or the phrasing or a decision, writing it down so that it's visible. We talked about the information radiators, and then having people fix it. Like, there's a good chance that what you thought was being decided maybe isn't quite correct. And so then you give people a chance to play a game of fix it with your words.
It's a great technique to help them really clarify what it is they want out of that session.
It's very cool. So looking at our time box here, I'm wondering, are there one or two more final tips for folks that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think working hard to stay out of their way, encouraging flow is another tip. So just be self-aware, work really hard to stay out of their way, allow them to get where they're going, and do things to kind of encourage them to work in that flow state where they're really they're really getting a lot done. They're really being productive, and then be the guardrails. So if you see them starting to work their way off track, don't tell them, but ask them if they're headed off track. Remind them of the goal and allow them to decide if where they're going is where they should be going, or if they're headed off track. And that's one of those we touched on earlier, I think, but it's really important to let them be the ones that they know. They're the ones who set the goal to begin with, and they know what they need for this meeting to be productive. And that's really what you're trying to do here, is help them have as productive a session as possible.
I think of questions like, how does this relate back to the goal? So you'd mentioned kind of embracing maybe your ignorance or your inexperience. So asking the question, hey, how does this relate back to the goal? And there's a good chance that they'll tell you, oh, it's this. Or they go, oh, it really doesn't. Let's pull back and refocus back onto that goal. And so just a simple question as opposed to saying, oh, you're off track.
Right, exactly.
Because they really might not be. So that is a nice exploration of facilitation tips. And I mentioned we'll put those up on the show notes. Are you reading anything interesting these days? I think the last time you shared Experimental Mindset, you had a couple different books, maybe Age of Agile and something on property investing you were reading. How's your reading and continuous learning journey going these days?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Dan. I just finished Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Amazing, especially if you're an entrepreneur or an investor like myself. That book is awesome because he's kind of like the original entrepreneur. Amazing. Loved it. Yeah.
Now, is it a specific autobiography? I'm imagining Ben Franklin maybe has many. Well, you said autobiography. I don't know if he wrote multiple autobiographies.
Well, we can put it in the show notes, Dan, because there are multiple, and this one is a bit of a kind of a sliced version. So they took a subsection of his entire fairly lengthy one, and then just put some context around it for entrepreneurs and investors. And we'll put it in the show notes so people could check it out if they're interested.
That's awesome. I believe it was some autobiographical works of his, and just, boy, if you want to feel like you've wasted your life, just check that autobiography out and the stuff that he was involved in.
Read it while you're young.
Yeah. I might have to, and the things he did while he was still young. Yeah, I'll have to check out that particular one. And yeah, Ben Franklin, always good to learn from.
He's awesome. And then I'm reading Thinking Fast and Slow, and that's really interesting. So that's what I'm working through right now. Thinking Fast and Slow.
Any particular insights from Thinking Fast and Slow?
I'm still pretty early into the book, but it's super fascinating when he's talking about how you can measure physical signs of your brain working really hard to process things, and how as humans, it's built in us to be lazy, not in a bad way, but to find the least amount of effort that you need to expend to get something done.
Yes. Well, and it's impossible to explicitly process all the information coming into you. And so, there's some things that become hardwired types of responses, or at least pretty firmly wired responses. And then there's slower thinking. So
right.
It's a fantastic topic to explore how the brain thinks.
And then the last one is the cash flow quadrant by Robert Kiyosaki.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that's about.
Oh, that's good stuff. We could put it in the show notes.
Okay. We'll do that. So we've got an investing, we've got one about thinking, and one about Benjamin Franklin. All right. Well, thanks for sharing on facilitation tips, as well as your continuous learning journey there, Adam.
Thanks for having me on, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by AgileThought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.